This is PowerPoint session number 1, the middle school concept. This entire session will be about middle school components, the concept, and the philosophy behind it. This is the outline that we'll be following. We'll look at some definitions. We will look at a little bit of history. We'll look at the rationale, which is an important one. The question about why we should have middle school is a big one right now. The components or the elements of a really good, well-functioning middle school. Differences among elementary, middle school, and secondary, and maybe more importantly, the differences between middle school and junior high. That's usually the issue in the general public that is the most misunderstood. When we look at the definitions, if I were to give you a formal one, I would tell you that it is a concept that results in a program that meets the needs of the young adolescent. Now notice we're saying it's a concept that then results in a program that meets the needs of the young adolescent. And by young adolescent, we're usually talking about students ages 10 to 14. There's usually some kind of configuration of grades 6 through 8. That's the most common configuration in middle schools across the country. But sometimes we see grades 5 through 8 in a building. Sometimes in that situation, grade 5 functions very much like an elementary setting. It's self-contained. Sometimes they're off by themselves. They don't really function like middle schools, although that's not always the case. This last definition is probably the most important one. Middle school is intended to bridge the gap between elementary and secondary. The way we run elementary schools is very different, of course, from how we run secondary schools. And there should be some kind of transition between those two. So transition is an important word in this entire course. And when we say transition, we're really talking about from elementary to secondary, but we're also referring to the transition that takes place within the years of middle school, and we'll talk about that more later. When we look at the history of middle schools, it's kind of interesting to note that our early junior highs were pretty developmentally appropriate. When American education started to separate out those middle kids from younger kids and older kids, the junior highs that they developed were pretty much what we would want to see today in a good middle school. Had the junior highs stayed that way, we probably would not have had a middle school movement, but they did evolve into something that we did not think was appropriate for the young adolescent. There has been a large increase in the number of middle schools since the 1950s. The 1950s was really when we saw the middle school movement begin, and at that time there were probably a couple of thousand middle schools across the United States. Now there are tens of thousands of them. One issue, however, that we must look at when we look at middle schools is whether the name of the school really indicates what's happening in the school. We know that there are lots of schools out there that are called whatever middle school, and there are also lots of schools out there called whatever junior high. You really cannot tell by the name of the school whether or not it's functioning as a middle school or a junior high. What is the rationale for middle school? We often tell our undergraduates who are in our middle school major that when they interview for a job, someone, a principal, a team leader, or someone will be asking them, why do we need to do middle school? And what they're really asking is, what is the rationale for middle school? One thing that could be a good response is young adolescents are developmentally in transition, requiring a special educational approach. Young adolescents truly are in transition. They are changing physically, cognitively, in every way that you want to think about. Much like if we were to look at preschoolers. Preschoolers require a special educational approach, and people who are in early childhood understand that very well. This is the same kind of issue. They're in a different phase of their life, and thus they require a special approach. Because for the young adolescent, self-concept and those related issues are so huge for them, we need to pay attention to that. It does affect how well they do in school. It does affect how well they do later. The way middle school is set up, as we'll talk about in a little bit, really addresses the issue of self-concept much better than a junior high would. And this may be the most important rationale for middle school of all right now, is that junior highs, our current junior highs, have become just like little high schools. Quite often, if you go into a junior high, the only difference that you would see from a high school is that the students are younger. We know that young adolescents are not ready for a high school setting or a high school approach or the high school expectations. But because so many junior highs have become little high schools, it becomes even more important to be sure that we're offering an appropriate middle school education for our young adolescents. Now we're ready to take a look at the components of a good, well-functioning middle school. This is a list of elements or components. There are 7 of them that we're going to be going through, and some of them, I believe, quite honestly, are more important than others. The first component is that each student has a home base and a teacher advisor. One of the confusing things about the phrase home base is that people automatically want to assume we mean home room, and that is not what we mean. By home base, we really mean the team. There is a team of teachers and students that form a smaller learning community within the larger school, and that is called the home base. Each student has one teacher who functions as his or her advisor, the teacher advisor, and we'll talk about advisory more in a little bit. Secondly, we would hope to see a flexible schedule, usually with some kind of a block. In junior highs and certainly in high schools, we see period after period after period. Maybe they're 50 minutes long each. Bells ring, kids move in the halls, and whatever learning is taking place at the end of a period will stop then because, of course, students have to move on. In a middle school, we hope that there's a huge block of time, hopefully in the afternoon and in the morning, maybe 2 to 2.5 hours long, that the team of teachers can dictate. They can decide how that block should be used. It's very possible that sometimes the block looks pretty much junior high-ish in that kids move from teacher to teacher to teacher in an organized fashion. But it might also mean that the team has designed a unit, an academic unit, and some days during this unit they decide to use the entire block for students to work on projects. So for the whole 2.5 hours in the morning, for example, students can use that to work on their projects. It also might mean that if you're the science teacher and you're doing a series of experiments that you know are going to take longer than usual, you and your other teachers, the other teachers on the team, can make those arrangements to let you do that. Have longer time with the students so that you get that done with them. And the experiment or whatever is not just cut off before it's finished. A flexible schedule would also allow, let's take the example of an academic unit again. Maybe you've established a series of stations that you want kids to rotate to, and you want them to rotate through the stations every 20 minutes. The flexible schedule allows you to do that, and you can take those small segments of time and take as long as you need in order for kids to rotate through those particular stations. Flexibility is really an important thing in the middle school. Interdisciplinary team teaching is also important. By interdisciplinary, we are talking about content areas. So on a team, you would have teachers that represented different content areas. So for example, a very typical team of teachers is one that has a science teacher, a social studies teacher, a language arts teacher, and a math teacher. You could have smaller teams. You could have 2 teacher teams where each of the 2 teachers are responsible for 2 content areas. You could have 3 teacher teams where there's some sharing of the content. There are also sometimes teams that have the 4 basic content areas but have added a reading teacher or maybe a special ed teacher. But all of the planning is done by this team of teachers. Number 4, multi-age grouping is really getting at the idea of meeting kids where they are developmentally, regardless of how old they are. So there are some middle schools out there that on Team B, or whatever they might call their team, has students of different ages, and in another setting they might actually be in different grades, but they put them together on this team because this is what fits them developmentally right now. This is one that is difficult to do, quite honestly, and for that reason a lot of middle schools will just have their 6th grade team, 7th grade teams, 8th grade teams, regardless of how old the kids are. This is one of those components that really does speak to the appropriateness of middle school, paying attention to the developmental stages that kids are at individually, but I'm admitting it's one of those that's difficult to pull off well. We're going to return to these, by the way, there are 3 major curriculum goals that should always be revisited as teachers are planning units and planning curriculum for their students, and we'll come back to those 3 goals in a little bit. Personalized instruction with continuous progress. This is very much a part of middle school philosophy, where we look at kids individually and we expect each child to progress and progress continuously, probably at their own rate. What that means is that kids who are strugglers still need to progress, and they still need to do it continuously, but we need to provide instruction and curriculum so that they can do that successfully. That also means that kids who are ahead of the game in whatever content area or in whatever way aren't standing still and waiting, that they are also progressing continuously. And that we would hope we could provide a wide range of exploratory activities. It's really at this age that students should be able to try new things without the threat of grades, or without the threat of feeling like they're going to be laughed at, or that they're taking a huge risk. They are taking risks, but they're positive risks. When we talk about exploratory programs within middle schools, that will become more clear. Okay, we're going to look a little closer at those 3 curriculum goals. The first is personal development. Whenever a team of teachers sits down to plan curriculum or to plan an academic unit for their team of students, they should continually be looking at the personal development of each of those students. They need to be thinking about ways to provide opportunities for success. Students need to feel that they are successful. Small aside here, most teachers don't really understand that, because most teachers have been academically successful throughout their school careers. And so it's very difficult for us to understand when kids don't feel like they're ever successful within the school day. And so we're talking about things like that, success, and also issues such as physical activity and those kinds of things that have to do with personal development. Those should all be considered as we look at curriculum. We should also be looking at skills for continued learning. Students will be continuing to learn once they're past us. And part of what we need to do as middle school teachers is to provide them skills to do that continued learning. So we're talking about the basic things like reading, writing, speaking, listening. They need to continue to learn to do those things for later. But things like library skills, lab skills, computer skills, critical thinking, learning to predict, critical analysis, all of those kinds of things are also part of those skills for continued learning. And every time teachers sit down to plan curriculum for their students, they need to revisit that issue. And then the last, in middle school, we need to provide them an introduction to areas of organized knowledge. There's a lot of content that's covered in middle school, there's no doubt about it, but not nearly in the depth that it will be later in high school at the secondary level. So when middle school students leave middle school, they should, for example, understand that social studies includes things like philosophy and history and economics and geography and anthropology and sociology. All those things are part of the social studies. And they may have done some in-depth things in any one of those, but we're giving them an introduction to those areas of organized